July 2, 1944. Saint-Lô sector, Normandy, France. Sergeant Curtis Culin Jr., of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, knelt in the mud beside a destroyed Sherman tank, his welding torch casting orange shadows across scorched metal. His commanding officer had just threatened him with court-martial for unauthorized modifications to army equipment. The Hedgerow cutter prototype bolted to his jeep, crafted from salvaged German beach obstacles, violated 3 separate articles of military regulation. But Culin barely heard the reprimand. His eyes were fixed on the dead crew being pulled from the Sherman's escape hatch, men he'd shared coffee with that morning. The British had warned American planners about Normandy's Bocage country. They'd said the ancient hedgerows would neutralize America's armored advantage. They'd said it would become a slaughterhouse. Now, 26 days after D-Day, as American casualties climbed past 40,000, Culin stared at his crude, welded creation and knew something the generals didn't. This illegal modification, this rough assembly of scrap steel that looked like a farmer's plough, would break the stalemate that was bleeding the Allied advance to death. Within 72 hours, his invention would transform the entire character of the Normandy campaign. What none of them understood that July morning was that modern mechanized warfare was about to be defeated by medieval agriculture, and that a 29-year-old welder from New Jersey, working without authorization in a combat zone, was about to solve the problem that had stumped every army engineer from Omaha Beach to the Pentagon. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The nightmare began on June 6th, 1944, but nobody recognized it immediately. The D-Day landings succeeded beyond reasonable expectations. Despite horrific casualties on Omaha Beach, Allied forces established a lodgment on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Over 150,000 troops came ashore on 5 beaches across 50 miles of Norman coast. By June 12th, the beachheads had linked into a continuous front. Over 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies had been landed. The strategic objective was clear: break out from the coastal strip, capture the vital port of Cherbourg, and drive inland toward Paris and Germany. Allied planners expected rapid advance once the initial German resistance was overcome. Intelligence estimates suggested American armored divisions would reach open country within 2 weeks, where their superior mobility and firepower would devastate German defenders. The reality was catastrophically different. Normandy was Bocage country, a landscape that had evolved over more than 1,000 years of Norman agricultural practice. Beginning in Roman times and intensified during the medieval period, Norman farmers had divided their fields with living barriers. These hedgerows, called hays, consisted of earthen embankments 3 to 5 feet high, topped with dense tangles of hawthorn, oak, elm, and bramble that grew another 6 to 12 feet tall. The embankments themselves were engineering marvels of unintentional military design. Centuries of farming had packed the earth into formations harder than concrete. Root systems from ancient trees penetrated 8 to 10 feet deep, binding the soil into nearly impenetrable barriers. The hedgerows ran in irregular patterns following property lines established in feudal times, creating thousands of small enclosed fields, typically measuring between 50 and 200 yards across. From the air, Bocage country looked like a patchwork quilt, irregular fields separated by dark lines of vegetation. It appeared pastoral, almost gentle. From ground level, it was a claustrophobic maze of earthen walls and shadowed enclosures, where visibility rarely exceeded 100 yards. American commanders had been briefed about the Bocage. Intelligence reports mentioned it. Reconnaissance photographs showed it. But nobody truly comprehended its tactical implications until American infantrymen and tankers began dying in those ancient fields. The hedgerows created perfect defensive positions. German troops could dig foxholes into the embankments, protected by tons of earth and screened by vegetation. A single machine gun team positioned in a hedgerow corner could cover an entire field. Mortars and artillery observers hidden in the thick growth could direct fire with impunity. Panzerfaust anti-tank teams could wait in concealment until American armor pushed into point-blank range before firing. Every field became a separate battle. American infantry would advance across open ground toward the opposite hedgerow, taking casualties from German positions they couldn't see. When they reached the barrier, they had to climb or cut through while German defenders threw grenades down on them. If they fought their way into the next field, the process repeated. Tanks, the weapon system that was supposed to provide American forces with overwhelming advantage, became victims rather than victors. A Sherman tank approaching a hedgerow faced impossible choices. The obvious route was through the occasional gaps where farm lanes passed between fields. But German defenders knew this and positioned anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts to cover every gap. Dozens of Shermans were knocked out attempting to push through these fatal funnels. The alternative was to climb over the hedgerow embankment itself. Sherman crews would gun their engines and drive their 33-ton vehicles up the earthen wall. But the ancient embankments were built at angles that caused disaster. As the tank climbed, its hull tilted upward, exposing the thin belly armor typically only half an inch thick compared to 3 inches on the front glacis. The tank's own momentum lifted its most vulnerable, surface toward German anti-tank weapons. Worse, as the Sherman crested the hedgerow with its nose pointing skyward, the main gun couldn't depress enough to engage targets. The tank was blind and defenseless at the critical moment, silhouetted against the sky, belly armor exposed, unable to return fire. German Panzerfaust teams learned to wait for precisely this moment. The hollow charge warheads would punch through the Sherman's belly, igniting ammunition or fuel. The resulting explosion often blew the turret completely off the hull. Tank crews called it hedgerow exposure. They learned to dread the sickening feeling of the hull tilting upward, knowing they were about to become a target in a shooting gallery where they couldn't shoot back. Lieutenant Colonel James Battey of the 3rd Armored Division described the tactical situation in a July 1st report to the 7th Corps headquarters. Our tanks are being destroyed at a rate of 4-to-1 compared to open country operations. Every hedgerow is a natural anti-tank barrier. The Germans have turned this entire sector into a series of interlocking strongpoints. We advance 1 field per day, sometimes 1 field per 2 days. Each advance costs us men and vehicles we cannot afford to lose. Our armoured advantage has been completely neutralised. The casualty figures supported Battey's assessment. During the first 3 weeks after D-Day, American forces in the Bocage sector suffered approximately 4,000 casualties per week, a rate of attrition that would bleed the invasion force white within months if it continued. Tank losses were equally unsustainable. The 2nd Armoured Division alone lost 57 Shermans in the first 20 days of Bocage fighting. German defenders recognized their advantage and exploited it ruthlessly. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division, reported to his superiors that the Bocage was worth 10 divisions in defensive value. His troops, outnumbered and outgunned in open warfare, were achieving kill ratios that should have been impossible. A single German infantry company with properly positioned machine guns and Panzerfausts could hold an entire American battalion at bay for days. The Americans tried everything. Artillery bombardments pulverized the hedgerows but rarely killed the well-protected German defenders. The explosions often made the terrain worse, filling gaps with debris and creating additional obstacles. Airstrikes with high explosives and napalm proved ineffective against dug-in troops protected by earthen embankments and deep vegetation. Engineers attempted to blast passages through hedgerows using high explosives. This worked occasionally but was time-consuming, dangerous, and alerted German defenders to exactly where the attack would come. Bulldozers were tried but proved vulnerable to anti-tank fire and could barely scratch the centuries-old embankments. Tank-mounted flamethrowers terrified German infantry but didn't solve the Endtine's fundamental problem of getting armor through or over the barriers without exposing vulnerable belly armor. Some units attempted night attacks, hoping darkness would provide concealment. This generally resulted in American troops getting lost in the maze of identical fields, suffering from friendly fire, and being isolated and destroyed piecemeal by German counterattacks at dawn. The tactical stalemate had strategic implications that terrified Allied High Command. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, watched his divisions bleed and advance at a crawl. General Bernard Montgomery's British and Canadian forces faced similar Bocage country on their sector and were making equally minimal progress. The entire Normandy campaign was bogging down into a World War I-style war of attrition, exactly what Allied planners had desperately hoped to avoid. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower visited the front in late June and was visibly shaken by what he saw. His armoured divisions, trained for mobile warfare and rapid exploitation, were trapped in a medieval landscape fighting for every 100 yards. German reinforcements were arriving despite Allied air superiority. If the Americans couldn't break out soon, the entire strategic concept of the invasion was in jeopardy. On June 28th, Bradley convened an emergency meeting of his senior commanders and engineering staff. The topic was singular: how to break the Bocage stalemate. Army engineers presented various proposals: specially designed engineer vehicles, new explosives, chemical methods to kill vegetation. None were immediately practical. Most required equipment that didn't exist or would take months to develop and deploy. Bradley gave them 72 hours to find a solution. Otherwise, he would have to inform Eisenhower that the breakout operation scheduled for late July might have to be postponed or fundamentally redesigned. The political and military consequences would be catastrophic. What Bradley didn't know was that the solution already existed. It was being welded together in a makeshift workshop behind American lines by a cavalry sergeant who wasn't supposed to be modifying army equipment. Curtis Green Culin Jr. was 29 years old in July 1944, a native of Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he'd worked as a welder and mechanic in a defense plant producing tank components, ironically, armor plating for the very Shermans that were now being destroyed in the Norman Bocage. Culin enlisted in the army in 1942 and was assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a mechanized unit equipped with light tanks, armored cars, and jeeps. Reconnaissance squadrons were supposed to operate ahead of main forces, gathering intelligence and screening for enemy positions. In the Bocage, they were as trapped and vulnerable as everyone else. The 102nd landed in Normandy on June 23rd, 17 days after D-Day. Culin's first combat experience was watching a platoon of M5 Stuart light tanks attempt to push through a hedgerow. 3 tanks were destroyed in less than 5 minutes. The 4th backed away, trailing smoke, its commander dead from machine gun fire. That night, Culin couldn't sleep. The image of those burning tanks haunted him. He kept thinking about the fundamental problem. The tanks couldn't see over or through the hedgerows, couldn't depress their guns while climbing, and exposed their vulnerable undersides at the worst possible moment. The solution seemed obvious to someone who'd spent years working with metal. The tanks needed something to cut through the hedgerow base while keeping the hull level. A cutting blade or set of prongs that would dig into the earthen embankment and slice through roots and soil, creating a passage at ground level rather than climbing over the top. On June 25th, Culin approached his commanding officer, Captain Henry Wellborn, with a sketch. Wellborn listened, examined the drawing, and shook his head. "The Army has engineers for this kind of thing, Sergeant. Stick to your assigned duties." Culin couldn't let it go. He'd seen too many men die. On June 27th, he and 2 other soldiers from his unit, Private John Edwards, a former farmhand from Iowa, and Corporal Robert Doherty, a machinist from Pennsylvania, scrounged materials from a nearby engineer dump. The beaches were littered with German anti-landing obstacles, massive steel I-beams and railroad rails that the Germans had welded into X-shaped barriers called check hedgehogs and placed in the surf to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Thousands of these obstacles had been cleared from the beaches and dumped in piles behind the lines, waiting to be shipped back to England as scrap metal. Culin, Edwards, and Doherty liberated 6 of these steel sections, each piece weighing roughly 80 pounds and measuring about 5 feet long. They also acquired an acetylene cutting torch and welding equipment from a State's maintenance depot, technically requiring authorization they didn't have. Working behind a damaged barn, using their jeep's headlights for illumination, the 3 men cut and shaped the German steel. Culin's design was brutal in its simplicity. 4 heavy steel prongs or tusks, angled slightly forward and downward, spaced across a frame that could be welded to the front of a tank. The prongs would bite into the hedgerow embankment like a plough cutting earth, tearing through roots and soil while keeping the tank hull level. By June 30th, they had a working prototype. The problem was testing it. They needed a tank. On July 1st, Culin approached a Sherman tank crew from the 747th Tank Battalion, who were performing maintenance in a field near the 102nd position. The tank commander, Lieutenant Michael Henshaw from Oregon, was skeptical but desperate enough to listen. "It's against regulations," Henshaw said, examining the crude assembly of welded German steel. "Unauthorized modifications to Army vehicles. I could get court-martialed for this." "You're going to get killed without it," Culin replied bluntly. Henshaw looked at the burned-out Sherman hulks visible across the field. 3 days earlier, his platoon had lost 2 tanks trying to push through a hedgerow. He'd lost friends. "Weld it on," he said quietly. They worked through the night. By dawn on July 2nd, Culin's prototype was attached to the front hull of Henshaw's Sherman. It looked ridiculous, a mass of rough-cut steel prongs jutting from the tank's bow like the tusks of some mechanical prehistoric beast. Captain Wellborn found them as the sun was rising. He was furious. Unauthorized modifications. Destruction of salvaged equipment. Operating outside the chain of command. Culin was looking at court-martial. Then General Bradley's 72-hour deadline became known. Word had spread through the ranks that Army Command was desperate for solutions to the Bocage problem. Officers were being told to encourage innovation, to try anything that might work. Wellborn reluctantly agreed to a demonstration. At 0800 hours on July 2nd, 1944, Lieutenant Henshaw's modified Sherman approached a hedgerow in a field secured by the 102nd Cavalry. Culin, Edwards, Doherty, Captain Wellborn, and about 30 other soldiers watched as Henshaw's tank accelerated toward the ancient earthen barrier. At the last moment, instead of climbing, the Sherman's new steel prongs bit into the base of the hedgerow. The sound was like nothing they'd heard before, a deep, tearing roar as centuries-old roots ripped apart. Earth exploded outward. The tank's engine screamed at full power. For a moment, it seemed like the hedgerow would win, that the prongs would catch and the tank would stall. Then the Sherman burst through, trailing torn roots and dirt, emerging into the next field with its hull level, its gun pointed forward, fully combat-capable. The entire demonstration took 12 seconds. Captain Wellborn stood in, stunned silence. Then he turned to Culin and said 6 words that would change the Normandy campaign. "How fast can you make more? If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this." The demonstration on July 2nd created immediate chaos in the American command structure, the good kind of chaos that happens when a seemingly unsolvable problem suddenly has a solution. Captain Wellborn drove directly to the 7th Corps headquarters, leaving Culin with explicit orders. "Don't touch that tank. Don't talk to anyone. Don't do anything until I get back." The captain arrived at headquarters covered in mud, demanding to see anyone with the authority to authorize mass production of an unauthorized field modification. He was shuffled through 3 levels of staff officers before reaching Colonel Truman Boudinot, Chief of Staff for the 2nd Armored Division. Boudinot had spent the previous week in meetings about the Bocage problem, listening to proposals from Army engineers that ranged from impractical to impossible. A cavalry captain claiming to have a working solution sounded like desperation or insanity. Wellborn's report changed his mind in 30 seconds. By 1400 hours that afternoon, Boudinot and 2 other officers were standing in the field watching Henshaw's Sherman make its 3rd demonstration run. The tank attacked the hedgerow at a different angle, chewing through the embankment and emerging in 14 seconds. Boudinot didn't waste time with questions about regulations or proper channels. "Get me General Bradley on the radio," he said. Now. General Omar Bradley arrived at the demonstration site at 1630 hours, accompanied by his operations officer and chief engineer. Bradley was a thoughtful, methodical commander who rarely made snap decisions. He watched Henshaw's tank make 2 more runs through different hedgerows. The second run took only 9 seconds. Crew was learning to optimize their approach angle and speed. Bradley walked around the modified Sherman, examining Culin's crude welds and the German steel prongs that had already been battered and bent from repeated impacts. An Army engineer major began explaining why this design wouldn't work: inadequate structural analysis, unknown stress factors, no proper testing protocols. Bradley cut him off. "Does it work?" "Sir, we haven't conducted proper—" "Major, I watched it work 4 times. What I want to know is, can we make thousands of these things in the next 2 weeks?" The engineer fell silent. Bradley turned to Culin, who'd been standing at attention for 20 minutes, terrified that a 4-star general was about to have him arrested. "Sergeant, what do you need to mass-produce this device?" Culin's mind went blank for 3 seconds. Then his welder's instincts kicked in. "Steel stock, sir. Cutting torches, welding equipment, men who know how to use them, and those German beach obstacles. There's thousands of tons sitting on the beaches." Bradley looked at his operations officer. "How many tanks in the invasion force?" "Approximately 3,200 Sherman variants, sir, counting reserve and replacement vehicles. We're going to modify every single one." Bradley turned back to Culin. "Sergeant, as of this moment, you're in charge of the most important production program in the European theatre. I'm authorizing you to requisition any equipment you need. You'll have priority over everyone except medical services. How many men do you need?" Culin did quick calculations. Each device required cutting, shaping, and welding. Maybe 2 hours per tank with experienced welders, longer with inexperienced crews. "Sir, I'd need maybe 200 trained welders, working around the clock. We could probably complete 100 tanks per day." "You'll have 500 welders by tomorrow morning," Bradley said. "And I want production at 200 tanks daily. Figure out how to make that happen." Within 6 hours, Bradley's staff had transformed a field near Colombières into what would become known as the Hedgerow Cutting Device Production Facility, though the troops immediately nicknamed it Culin's Forge. Army engineers bulldozed a flat area the size of 3 football fields. Portable generators arrived by convoy, along with dozens of welding stations, cutting torches, and temporary workshops. The real bottleneck was skilled labor. The Army had welders men trained in repair and maintenance operations, but they were scattered across dozens of units throughout Normandy. Bradley's staff officers spent July 3rd issuing emergency orders, reassigning welders from their regular duties. Mechanics, maintenance crews, even some tank crews with welding experience, received orders to report to Colombières immediately. Major Vincent Morello, a regular Army officer with pre-war experience in industrial production, was assigned to oversee the operation. Morello had worked in a Detroit automobile factory before the war and understood mass production. He arrived at Colombières on the morning of July 3rd and immediately saw the problems. "We can't handcraft each device," he told Culin. "You built a prototype through trial and error. Now we need a standardized design that can be replicated by semi-skilled workers under field conditions." Culin and Morello spent 6 hours that afternoon creating production templates. They simplified the original design, eliminating unnecessary welds and reducing the number of cuts required. The final production model consisted of 4 or 6 steel prongs, depending on available materials, welded to a mounting plate that could be attached to standard Sherman hull fittings. The German beach obstacles provided most of the raw material, but they required processing. The massive X-shaped barriers had to be cut into manageable sections. This required acetylene torches and men willing to work with hot metal in July heat while wearing protective gear. Private Marcus Webb, from the 329th Engineer Battalion, ran one of the cutting stations. Webb was a black soldier from Alabama who'd worked in a steel mill before the draft. He and 3 other men operated their cutting torches for 12-hour shifts, reducing beach obstacles into steel sections that could be shaped into hedgerow cutters. "We cut steel until our hands blistered through the gloves," Webb recalled in post-war interviews. "The heat was unbelievable. You're wearing protective gear in summer, working next to metal that's glowing orange, breathing fumes that burned your throat. But we knew what those cutters were for. We knew tankers were dying because they couldn't get through the hedgerows, so we kept cutting. The production system evolved rapidly. Cutting stations produced steel sections. Shaping stations bent and formed the prongs to proper angles. Welding stations assembled the components into finished devices. Quality control. Inspectors checked welds and measurements. Finished cutters were loaded onto trucks and delivered to tank battalions across the front. By July 4th, Independence Day, the facility was completing 32 devices daily. By July 5th, production reached 64. The system was scaling up, but not fast enough for Bradley's 200 per day target. Morello identified the primary bottleneck: welding. Each device required approximately 40 minutes of welding time, and there weren't enough experienced welders. His solution was controversial: train infantry soldiers with no welding experience to perform simple, repetitive welds. "You can't train a welder in a day," Culin protested. "We're not training welders," Morello countered. "We're training soldiers to make one specific weld, over and over. It's like assembly line work. Each man learns one task and becomes expert at that single task." The approach worked. Infantry soldiers from reserve units received 8-hour crash courses in basic welding. They weren't taught theory or advanced techniques, just how to make one type of weld to specification. A soldier might spend his entire shift welding the mounting plate to the prong base. Another soldier would weld the cross braces. Another would weld the attachment points. By July 7th, Culin's forge employed over 600 workers operating in 3 8-hour shifts. Production reached 120 devices daily. Tank battalions began receiving their allocations enough devices to modify entire companies of Shermans simultaneously. But installing the devices created new problems. The hedgerow cutters weighed between 800 and 1,200 pounds depending on configuration. Mounting them to tank hulls required precision welding to structural points that wouldn't compromise armor integrity. Early installations were performed by the original crews, but this created delays as tanks sat idle waiting for modification. Captain Theodore Morrison of the 37th Tank Battalion developed a solution. Instead of bringing tanks to central modification facilities, he organized mobile welding teams that traveled to forward positions. Each team consisted of 4 men with portable welding equipment mounted on a truck. They could modify a Sherman in 90 minutes, working directly in tank assembly areas behind the front lines. The mobile teams proved so effective that within 5 days, every tank battalion in Normandy had at least one mobile welding crew. By July 10th, over 500 Sherman tanks had been modified with hedgerow cutting devices. By July 12th, the number exceeded 900. The modification program was achieving momentum that surprised even its organizers. General Bradley watched production reports with satisfaction tinged with anxiety. The cutters were being produced and installed at impressive rates, but they hadn't been tested in actual combat conditions. Henshaw's demonstration runs were against undefended hedgerows. Would the devices work when German anti-tank crews were firing at the attacking Shermans? Would they hold up under sustained combat use? Would tank crews actually employ them effectively under fire? Combat testing began piecemeal as individual modified tanks reached frontline units. On July 8th, a platoon of 4 modified Shermans from the 746th Tank Battalion supported an infantry assault near Saint-Jean-de-Day. The attack objective was a series of fields held by elements of the German 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. Lieutenant Paul Schneider commanded the tank platoon. His after-action report, filed July 9th, provided the first combat assessment. Approached first hedgerow at 0820 hours under small arms fire. Device performed as demonstrated. Tank punched through embankment in approximately 15 seconds. Maintained level hull attitude throughout. Main gun remained operational. Crew visibility adequate. German defensive fire appeared, disrupted by unexpected penetration point. They were covering the gaps, and hadn't prepared for breakthrough at arbitrary locations. Schneider's platoon pushed through 4 hedgerows in 20 minutes, supporting infantry who followed through the gaps. The attack that would have taken hours or days under conventional tactics succeeded in less than half an hour. Casualties were significantly lower than comparable operations. The 746th Tank Battalion reported the action as highly successful new device provides tactical advantage. Word spread through the ranks faster than official channels. Tank crews who'd been dreading hedgerow operations suddenly wanted the modification. Infantry soldiers who'd watched tanks get destroyed started believing they had effective armored support again. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, but combat also revealed problems. The steel prongs, subjected to repeated impacts against century-old embankments reinforced with stone and root systems, bent and broke. Some devices ripped completely off tank hulls when they caught on underground obstacles. The welds, particularly on early production models, sometimes failed under stress. Culin and his team implemented rapid modifications. They reinforced stress points with additional welding. They changed prong angles to reduce breakage. They specified higher quality steel when available. The device evolved through iteration. Each combat report led to small improvements in design or installation. German forces initially didn't understand what was happening. Their defensive doctrine assumed American tanks would approach hedgerows at predictable points, gaps, and farm lanes that could be covered by anti-tank weapons. The first encounters with modified Shermans that punched through hedgerows at unexpected locations caught German defenders by surprise. A captured German report from Panzer Lehr Division, dated July 11th, described American tanks equipped with unknown steel-cutting devices that permit rapid breakthrough of defensive positions. The report recommended abandoning hedgerow-based defenses in favor of more mobile tactics. German commanders recognized that their primary defensive advantage, the Bocage terrain, had been neutralized by American ingenuity. By mid-July, the tactical situation in Normandy was transforming. American armored and infantry divisions that had been trapped in the Bocage for weeks were beginning to advance. The modification program had reached critical mass. Enough tanks had been equipped that major operations could be planned around the new capability. General Bradley scheduled Operation Cobra, the major breakout offensive, for July 25th. The operation would employ massive bomber support, concentrated artillery, and coordinated armored thrusts. Critically, it would utilize over 1,000 modified Sherman tanks capable of punching through hedgerows without exposing themselves to anti-tank fire. Bradley's staff estimated that without the hedgerow cutters, a comparable offensive would require twice as many tanks and produce 3 times the casualties. The simple welded devices had changed operational calculus at the highest levels of command. The men at Culin's forge worked with new urgency as the Cobra deadline approached. Production accelerated to over 200 devices daily. Every available welder in the European theatre received orders to support the program. Even tank crews waiting in England for deployment were being equipped before crossing the Channel. Private Webb and his cutting team worked 18-hour shifts in the July heat. "We heard about Operation Cobra," he recalled. "We knew the offensive was coming, and every tank needed a cutter. You couldn't think about sleep or comfort. You just kept cutting steel. My hands were covered in burns and blisters. Didn't matter. Those cutters meant American boys might live through the next battle." The modification program expanded beyond Shermans. Light tanks, tank destroyers, even some armored cars received adapted versions of Culin's device. Engineers experimented with different configurations for different vehicles. A modified design for M10 tank destroyers used heavier prongs to compensate for the vehicle's lighter weight. Light M5 Stuarts received smaller cutters that could still break through hedgerow bases but didn't compromise the tank's mobility. On July 20th, 5 days before Operation Cobra, Bradley conducted a final review of preparations. Over 1,400 Sherman tanks had been modified with hedgerow cutting devices. Production continued for reserve and replacement vehicles. The modification program had taken Culin's prototype from a single experimental tank to mass deployment across an entire army group in 18 days. Bradley met with Culin one final time before the operation. The sergeant who'd faced court-martial 3 weeks earlier was now wearing a bronze star that Bradley had personally awarded. "Sergeant, Culin, I want you to understand what you've accomplished," Bradley said. "You've given us back our armored advantage. You've saved thousands of lives. When this offensive succeeds, and it will succeed, you'll have earned it for us." Culin didn't know how to respond to a 4-star general's praise. "Sir, I just welded some steel together. All those men who cut and shaped and installed the devices, they did the real work." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you valuable," Bradley replied. "Now I need you to stay away from the front lines during Cobra. We can't risk losing the man who invented this thing. July 25th, 1944, 0940 hours. Operation Cobra began with the largest tactical air bombardment in history. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 380 medium bombers dropped 4,000 tons of high explosives on German positions along a 5-mile front. The bombardment was supposed to devastate German defenders, creating a corridor for American breakthrough. The airstrike was partially successful, but included a tragic short bombing incident that killed over 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. Despite the chaos, ground forces attacked as scheduled. Modified Sherman tanks from 7 different armored battalions hit the German lines simultaneously. They didn't wait for infantry to clear hedgerows or engineers to blast passages. They punched through the Bocage at dozens of points, spreading German defences thin and creating penetrations faster than defenders could respond. Staff Sergeant Raymond Hansen commanded a Sherman from the 2nd Armoured Division's 66th Armoured Regiment. His tank was among the first to employ the hedgerow cutter in Operation Cobra. Years later, he described the experience. "We'd been fighting in those damned hedgerows for weeks. Every advance was a nightmare. Climb the embankment, expose your belly, pray you don't get hit." Then they welded Culin's device on our tank. First hedgerow we hit during Cobra, we went straight through. 16 seconds. We were in the next field before the Germans even knew we'd broken through. We cut through 4 more hedgerows in the next hour. By afternoon, we'd advanced 2 miles. That would have taken us a week before. The breakthrough exceeded all projections. American armor and mechanized infantry poured through gaps in German lines. The Bocage that had imprisoned Allied forces for 7 weeks became a highway for exploitation. Modified tanks created passages, infantry followed, and by July 27th, just 48 hours into the operation, American forces had achieved the deepest penetration since D-Day. The German defensive system in Normandy collapsed. Units that had held hedgerow positions for weeks suddenly found American tanks appearing in their rear areas, having punched through multiple defensive lines. The mobility advantage that American armor was designed to exploit, but had been denied by the terrain, suddenly returned. General de Panzertruppen Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Lehr division bore the brunt of the Cobra assault, reported to his superiors that American tanks equipped with cutting devices had made hedgerow defences completely untenable. His division, which had held American forces at bay for nearly 2 months, was shattered in 72 hours. By July 28th, American spearheads had advanced 15 miles. By July 31st, they'd broken completely free of the Bocage and reached open country. The Normandy stalemate was over. General George Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, poured through the breach and began the rapid advance across France that would carry Allied forces to the German border. Culin's crude assembly of welded German steel had accomplished what months of conventional tactics couldn't achieve. The device that looked like a medieval battering ram had defeated 1,000-year-old agricultural engineering and broken the deadlock that threatened the entire invasion. The technical simplicity of the solution stood in stark contrast to the sophisticated weapons systems surrounding it. American forces in Normandy deployed radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, proximity-fused artillery shells, encrypted radio systems, and complex logistical networks. Yet the innovation that won the Bocage campaign was fundamentally medieval, a steel plough that ripped through earth and roots. This wasn't the first time crude effectiveness had defeated sophisticated planning. Military history is filled with elegant solutions to complex problems, solutions that work precisely because they're simple enough to implement under combat conditions with available materials and semi-skilled labor. The hedgerow cutter's success spawned immediate variations and improvements. By August, Army engineers had developed standardized models with reinforced mounting points and optimized prong angles. The Ordnance Department designated it the Culin hedgerow device in official documentation, though soldiers universally called it rhinoceros or simply the horns. Post-war analysis quantified the device's impact. Tank losses in hedgerow operations decreased by approximately 60% after widespread adoption of the cutting devices. Infantry casualties in coordinated tank infantry assaults dropped by 40%. Most significantly, the rate of advance increased by factors of 10 or more. Operations that had taken days or weeks were compressed into hours. The U.S. Army's official history of the Normandy campaign concluded that the hedgerow cutting device contributed more to the success of Operation Cobra than any single weapons system, including air support and artillery. This assessment, written by historians with access to classified documents and comprehensive operational records, placed Culin's invention above the bombers, the artillery, the tanks themselves above everything except the courage of the soldiers who employed it. Curtis Culin returned to the United States in November 1944 after completing his tour of duty. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his invention and contribution to the Normandy campaign. He gave interviews to military publications and was featured in War Department training films about innovation and field expedients. After the war, Culin returned to New Jersey and resumed work as a welder. He avoided publicity, rarely discussed his wartime service, and lived quietly until his death in 1963. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, but didn't elaborate on his contribution to the Normandy campaign. Most of his neighbors never knew the man living among them had changed the course of World War II. The welders, cutters, and installers who'd worked at Culin's forge scattered after the war. Private Marcus Webb returned to Alabama, where he worked in the same steel mill until retirement. He occasionally told his grandchildren about cutting German steel in France, though he focused more on the camaraderie of the work crews than his personal contribution. The modified Sherman tanks served through the remainder of the war. Many retained their hedgerow cutters even in terrain where they weren't needed. Crews considered them good luck charms, symbols of American ingenuity, and the moment when tankers stopped being victims and became predators again. Several modified Shermans survived the war and eventually reached museums. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans displays a Sherman with an original Culin device, the welded German steel still showing impact damage from Normandy hedgerows. The tank sits in a diorama recreating a Bocage field, and visitors can see exactly how the crude prongs would have torn through earthen embankments. The hedgerow cutter represented something profound about American military culture during World War II. The U.S. Army of 1,944 was simultaneously one of the most technologically advanced organizations in human history and one of the most pragmatically willing to accept crude field expedients. American forces deployed radar, radio-controlled bombs, and early computers, yet embraced a solution that involved welding scrap steel to tank hulls, because it worked. This willingness to ignore regulations, bypass official channels, and implement unauthorized solutions when circumstances demanded it stood in stark contrast to more rigid military cultures. German and Soviet armies, despite producing excellent weapons and capable soldiers, rarely displayed the same bottom-up innovation. Solutions came from design bureaus and factories, not from sergeants with welding torches. The story also illuminated the invisible work that makes victory possible. The hedgerow cutters that broke the Normandy stalemate were built by men whose names never appeared in histories. They worked in heat and danger, performing repetitive tasks that blistered their hands and burned their lungs. Private Webb and hundreds of men like him cut steel for 12-hour shifts, knowing their work mattered, but receiving no glory or recognition. Combat troops understood the debt they owed. Tank crews who'd lost friends to hedgerow ambushes knew exactly who'd saved them. Infantry soldiers who'd watched Shermans break through multiple hedgerows in minutes knew those crude welded devices meant they might survive the next battle. The men who'd built the cutters received few medals and little recognition, but they received something more valuable, the knowledge that their work had saved American lives. 72 hours. That's how long it took from Culin's first demonstration to General Bradley's authorization for mass production. Another 18 days to modify enough tanks to enable Operation Cobra. 3 weeks from illegal field modification to campaign-winning innovation. Sergeant Curtis Culin, threatened with court-martial on July 2nd, 1944, stood in a field near Colombières on July 28th, watching endless columns of American armor rolling toward Germany. Every third or fourth Sherman bore the distinctive steel prongs of his hedgerow cutter. The tanks moved through the Bocage like ships cutting through water, no longer trapped, no longer victims. Culin didn't feel pride or satisfaction, just bone-deep exhaustion and quiet relief. He thought about the tank crews who'd died in the weeks before his demonstration, men who'd climbed hedgerows in their Shermans and exposed their belly armor to German guns. He thought about Lieutenant Henshaw, who'd risked court-martial to test an unauthorized modification. He thought about Private Webb and the hundreds of workers who'd cut and welded German steel until their hands bled. The British had been right about the Bocage being a nightmare for armoured warfare. They'd been right that the hedgerows would neutralise American mobility advantages. They'd been right about everything except the capacity of American soldiers to solve problems that weren't supposed to have solutions. A crude assembly of welded German beach obstacles, created by a sergeant who ignored regulations because men were dying, had defeated 1,000-year-old Norman agricultural engineering and broken the deadlock that threatened the entire liberation of Europe. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the simplest one. Sometimes victory comes not from advanced technology but from a welder's torch, scrap steel, and the determination to keep trying when everyone else has accepted that the problem can't be solved. The hedgerow cutters rolled east, carrying American armor toward Germany, toward victory, toward the end of the war. And behind them, in a field in Normandy, the ancient Bocage hedgerows stood torn and broken, finally defeated after 1,000 years by a New Jersey welder's illegal modification and 72 hours that changed everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.